You're listening to the Rosenfeld Review. I'm Lou Rosenfeld, and my guest today is Rachael Dietkus. Rachel's a social worker, designer, and founder of Social Workers Who Design. Rachael, welcome to the Rosenfeld Review.
Thank you for having me.
Rachael is one of these people that I learned about. I learned about you through your presentation at Civic Design 2021 last December. And what I was going to say is you're one of these people who is at the intersection of really interesting things. And this is kind of what I live for and why I'm really interested in UX and all the related things, because there are so many related things and they keep intersecting, right? It's like this synthetic field that keeps touching on other fields and they kind of bump into each other and cool things happen. And I just find the people who plant themselves at those intersections to be really interesting and are doing the most interesting work. So no pressure, Rachael, but I wanted to talk about your particular intersection of social work and design. So, let me ask you this. What is the intersection? So it's really three areas, as I recall from visiting your site, that you have a Venn diagram around. What are those?
Yeah, for me, they have boiled down to these three main intersections in how I practice, how I think about this work, and how I try to, you know, evolve it in different ways. It's really centering on social work values, design research methods and methodologies, and then trauma informed, or sometimes I will say trauma responsive, but trauma informed care principles. And how do the melding and integration of these three, how do they show up? One of the things that I often have told people is that uh, anything that I do in design, I'm really first seeing it through this lens as a social worker. Like it used to be, I used to try to separate the two, and then I just gave up trying to suppress that and just embraced it because it is just a lens in which I see so much of the world at this point.
So, social work is, as I learned from reading some of your materials, a care field,
Mm,
and that
yes.
makes perfect sense to me. And people who are, thinking about how to help others through trauma, obviously that's a facet of care. I hadn't really thought of user experience design as a care field, but what else would it be, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we think about the all of the facets and the elements of engagement that happen through UX. And I would say, just even broadly speaking, through other elements of design, the anthropological pieces, the building relationships, establishing rapport, hearing other people's stories, like what does that mean? So we have these umbrella ways of doing and thinking about this work and how we apply it, and then there's the specific processes and ways in which we do that work. And I think that's where some of those really strong elements of care start to unfold and show up and look like different things to different people, especially depending on if they are approaching their work. I'm thinking of some of the different UX researchers I know who have strong backgrounds in psychology or strong backgrounds in anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they're bringing these other disciplines. I mean, those are just two of many, many examples, but they're bringing these other disciplines into how they approach that work. And I just think that's one of the beauties of elevating those elements of care um and really is all of the different trauma informed care principles. Like they can show up, we can dial them up or dial them down in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So we have the anthropologists who are jumping into this area and have been obviously for a long time. And
Mhm.
it seems like about every other day I run into someone in the field with a theater background, and Then there's
A lot of theater.
I think of someone like my wife, a longtime journalist who's now a UX writer. A lot of journalists jumping in, and it's great every time a new practice joins up in this different kind of care field. I suppose it does improve everything we do, and it does help us show up in new ways. Talk a little bit about the journey that you've been on. So you're now we're maybe you're one of the first. I don't know, but we're going to probably see a lot of people from areas like social work who are joining in the design process and the research process in one way or another. How did you get here?
Yeah. Oh, it's always such a good question, and I probably answer this in different in a variety of ways depending on the context and like how far back do I go? Do you go back to childhood? Do you go back to your college days? Um, and I'll start somewhere in the middle. I decided to pursue social work after having this really unique and monumental experience as a delegate at the United Nations. And it was back in 2006. I just a very like rare and unique opportunity to be one of a small number of people who were just part of some very specific work around health and human rights. And while I was there, I just realized the size of the world and the what felt like at the time a relatively small number of people who were making very big decisions on serious and complex matters that were going to impact billions of people around the world. And so I came back home and thought, I like, how do I do more of this work? How do I pursue this on a deeper level, in a broader way? And just at the time, I think there was such a push, that was this inherent push that if you want to do this kind of work, if you want to do field work that is in this human rights space, you just absolutely had to have at least a graduate degree, so something at the master's level. And so I come back and I'm just like kind of weighing these different options of like, what do I want to do? Do I want to get a master's of public policy? Do I want to go back to school and maybe get a law degree? I was just really considering what might be a good path or route for me. And I had a friend and colleague at the time who said that I should really look into this Master of Social Work program because there's a track that is tailored towards people who want to do macro practice.
Hmm.
And I very distinctly remember saying like, oh, no, 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 like I absolutely have no desire or no interest in ever being a social worker. I do not want to do that. And I mentioned that because I had a limited view of what a social worker could do. And this friend did not, she just didn't let up on it. So she, back then when you would have actual brochures about programs and whatnot, when she comes back to me, she said, I just think that you should meet with this person. You should meet with Steve Anderson, who is now the dean of the School of Social Work, where I got my MSW. But he was the person who started this macro specialization on advocacy, leadership, and social change, like all things that I had just been doing or had been doing for years in the nonprofit sector. So I said, well, all right, fine. Like, I'll meet with this person and I'll see what he has to say, kind of, having whatever, early 30s arrogance that I might have had at the time. And I just shared with him in the most like honest and open and authentic way that this is work that I've been doing, that I had worked for a small nonprofit working on abolition of the death penalty, that I had worked on, women's rights and student leadership and advocacy, and that I had just had this wild and monumental experience at the United Nations. And he just the look on his face, I couldn't tell then if he was just like, get this person out of my office. He paused and he said, you are precisely the type of student that we are looking for this particular track,
Hmm.
because you have life experience, you have work experience, you're dedicated to these issues and to these causes. and I just, that conversation, I was hooked. I thought, well, I have to apply to this program. And it was the only program I applied to. I didn't look at other social work programs around the country, and I just really gave it my all, and committed to allowing that program to be this vehicle that would open up this very unknown world of other opportunities. I mean, I really had no idea where this might lead me. I didn't have any type of anticipation or even interest. I didn't even know that I had an interest in maybe pursuing work at the federal government, or even deepening this work within design. I mean, it was just it I think about that I think about that friend who just kept pressing this issue with me, and then that meeting that I had with this now, dean of the School of Social Work, that literally changed my life. I mean, it set me on a completely different course that I never could have predicted.
Wow. And so you go down that path, you get your master's degree in social work, and then you find yourself in a position where you are being pulled toward design somehow. Tell us
Yeah,
about
it
that.
probably it probably seems like, how did that, how did that occur? Well, it was while I was pursuing the MSW program. This is a story I'd love telling, because it's another person that has just been such a figure in this work for me. But it was probably 2009. I started pursuing my MSW in 2008, graduated in 2010. But it was 2009. My um, I think he was my husband. He was my spouse at the time, but we were at a farm to table dinner, and there was this woman that she just looked cool. I have no other way to, no other like
Well, she's a
funny or
UX
flashy way.
person. We all look cool. Yes,
But
me
she just,
especially.
I was like, oh, she's got brown hair. She was very smiley. She just had an energy. I could just feel this animated presence in her, and she had cool glasses, and I just thought, like, who is this person? I kept looking at her, wondering if I knew her from something, and I totally didn't. But we end up walking around, the grounds of this farm to table dinner, and her name's Maya Bruck, and she is, of course, a designer. And we strike up this conversation, and within literally a matter of minutes, I mean, literally a matter of minutes, she shares that she had started this organization called the Champaign Urbana Design Org, and that she really wanted to gather all the different creatives and designers in the community to give back to the nonprofit, community, and to help them with their website and a new logo, and various like marketing materials. And she said, but we're having a hard time like identifying like someone who like understands design but also understands the local nonprofit world. And I thought, like, is this like divine intervention? Like, what is this that is happening? I said, well, I know the local nonprofit world. I've been working in that sector for the past, like decade. And so I got really involved with the Champaign Urbana Design Org, and we did a couple of these events. We did a lot of different community engagement events around design. And so for those who are actively designers and practicing designers, but also those who were just like design fans, like that's what I would have called myself back then. But I was very involved with that organization at the community level, joined the board for a number of years while I was working on my MSW. And the thing where I started to see this next wave of, okay, how and where and why and how do these things intersect for me as a social worker, and as this someone who is just a super huge like design fan. And it came down to the way that we would do these, we called them like, a whole day like design charrette and design-a-thon, where we're working with these nonprofit leaders and the individuals who are utilizing these nonprofits. And I was like a translator. I was
Mm-hmm.
the bridge and the connector, because I knew about just the ins and outs and the worries and the various things that you're concerned about as a nonprofit leader, and as a participant. And then also, but I knew enough of the design language to be able to like serve as a translator to help convey those concepts. And I I just loved it. I mean, I felt like I was useful. It was energizing. And I just wanted more of that in my life. And so the biggest outlet for that was really being involved with Kudo on a local level, and then trying to find these very explicit opportunities to bring some of that love and appreciation of design into the work that I was doing as a social worker at Veterans Affairs.
Hmm.
So, so kind of this, a hard thing to make happen, because we weren't, as a social worker, I was neck deep in the actual practice and the service of helping people, where yes, many elements of design are present, but we didn't explicitly talk about it that way.
Well, it doesn't surprise me that translation was a word you brought up
Mm,
as a skill or a characteristic or quality that you brought to, in this case, an intersection, right? I mean, that seems to be what often happens, especially for people who are kind of plumbing new areas or exploring new areas of intersection between, in this case, design and social work. There is some need for translation. I'll just gripe for a moment and say I don't understand why we don't emphasize our role in translation between existing practices or functions or what have you, or even fields. It just seems like maybe we take it for granted. But anyway, this is not a podcast about me griping. It's a podcast about you talking. We're going to come back to you talking after the break, where let's get into some of the actual principles that unite these two areas at the intersection, and how designers can really take advantage of what social workers already know to do a better job in their own work. So we'll take a break right now. We'll be right back. Hey, I want to tell you about our next conference, Advancing Research 2022. It's coming up March 9th through 11th. It is going to be virtual. And this is going to be the third edition of Advancing Research. We started it up back in 2020 because we saw a lot of trends that are taking research in new directions and had converged, ranging from the democratization of research to researchers getting a more strategic role, a seat at the table, to different research fields starting to converge, on and on and on. That's what the conference has been about. We've really been trying to push research forward, and we're going to do it again. March 9th through 11th. It's going to be virtual this year, and we have a great virtual format. I think if you talk to people who've been to our conferences, if you haven't already, don't ask me, ask them what they thought. Anyway, I hope we'll see you at Advancing Research 2022, March 9th through 11th. Welcome back to the Rosenfeld Review. I'm Lou Rosenfeld. My guest today is Rachael Dietkus, social worker, designer, founder of Social Workers Who Design. I didn't mention earlier somehow that Rachel's also a panelist at Advancing Research 2022. That is the third edition of a conference Rosenfeld Media launched 3 years ago, obviously. And she is participating in a panel led by Matt Bernius of Code for America called Learnings from Applying Trauma-Informed Principles to the Research Process. And it's really a great panel. Matt, Rachael, Alba Villamil from Humanity Centered, and Aditi Joshi, also from Code for America. And that's a good lead into what I think we should get into now, which is talking about how social work and trauma-informed principles can be utilized by researchers. And I don't know, maybe there's a little bit of design and research goodness that helps social workers. But I think our audience is primarily the folks who need to learn from your home territory of social work. So how do these things come together?
mm. Well, I think one of the earlier ways, a handful of years ago, that I would talk about this work, and I felt like I was trying to convince social workers that we need to be embracing design and design principles, and why aren't we doing this in social work? which is funny because so much of my focus now is really in predominantly design spaces. But I would talk about how a couple different things. One is that social workers often see the impact of bad design and bad policies, and that's a quote from a fellow social worker and UX researcher, Lindsay Cochran, and she said this in a piece that she wrote a few years ago that really just illuminated that designers are, generally speaking, are on this side of creation and problem solving, but social workers are are more often than not are reacting to designed problems and systems that have been sometimes poorly designed, or policies that are not holistic and are not and need to be redesigned.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just when you size up the two disciplines, you can see where there are these similarities, of course, around areas around like relationship building, rapport building, empathy and compassion. Like, absolutely, it's like social workers can learn from designers, and designers can learn from social workers, and how we each approach that. But when it comes to some of these, what a friend and colleague, Jerry Scullion in the UK, like talks about, he talks about these the complexity, the serious and complex situations that we are often facing as designers, and how we might not always have the skills or the education or the preparation to really navigate some of those challenges. Like, we can do that, yes, of course, from a design
Mm-hmm.
lens and from a design perspective. But what happens when things go wrong in design? What happens when designers themselves may be experiencing secondary or vicarious trauma, or burnout from organizational trauma, or our participants that we are inviting into these processes with us, that um, like, how do we navigate and maneuver through the high potential for harm to potentially be caused by the way that we do design.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of different ways to think about it. One of the things that we were talking about just in this morning as part of our preparation for the panel at the Advancing Research Conference was, we don't want to just, like, we as this like collective that will be talking much more in depth about this, we don't want to talk about how and why we need to be trauma informed ACT participants. Like, it goes far beyond that, and it would be a disservice to just be talking about that transactional aspect of how we can be, or how we could be or should be trauma informed in this
Mm-hmm.
work. Like, we really need to embrace those principles, maybe adapt and reimagine those principles, for design and for us as designers. Like, but what does that mean? Like, I have a number of ideas of what that means to me as a social worker and as a designer. And I've just at this point hundreds of conversations with designers and social workers, like, around the world, about what that how that's troubling to them, because it isn't being discussed, and because they don't have that literacy around trauma yet to really um, go deeper on these concepts and on these principles.
So, can you, yeah, sure, Lou, in like 30 seconds, I'm sure Rachel can summarize the whole thing. But can you give us an example, at least, of a an area where having that well, give us an example of that literacy. Maybe that would be the best thing to start with, because it sounds like
Yeah.
there's so much, and we're all living through this horrible crash course in trauma on top of the normal stuff this last 2 years.
Yeah.
So, can you fill it in a little bit for us?
Yeah. So let's just look at it's the first, and it's not meant to be the most important in terms of being first, but it's just the first principle in trauma informed care principles that were created by the CDC and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration here in the US. And the first one is safety. And so I think about what does it mean to feel safe, to be safe, to ensure safety for everyone who is involved in the design research process. So not just the interviews that we conduct, not just the way that we ask questions, or ensuring that we are not being extractive and manipulative in how we're doing interviews. I really feel like it's that entire continuum. So if we look at what are the preconditions that need to exist, either as a team or as a project, as part of that process at the organizational level, a lot of different ways that you can slice and dice this. But what are those preconditions that we might need in order to even be or become trauma informed?
Mm-hmm.
And then what are we, and we'll get into this in the panel, but what are those things that we can do after the research has maybe been done, where we're writing up our report, we're synthesizing our information? How do we honor people's reality? How do we include them in that process to maybe have them review what we are going to write, to ensure that it is accurate and that it is honest and it's authentically represented in the way that they want it to be represented? So that's one particular way. A more specific example of this, I would say, is, and it's this idea that I've been thinking around, that comes from social work practice, but this notion of a safety plan.
Mm-hmm.
So when I worked at Veterans Affairs, whether a veteran needed a safety plan or not, every single veteran had a safety plan. So like, you didn't have to be in crisis in order to have a safety plan. And so I think about that a lot in the context of design. Like, what would it look like if everyone who was part of this process, so this research, this interview, this fill in the blank thing that we're doing, this step in what we're doing, like, what would it look like if we all had a safety plan?
Hmm.
And what does that mean? Because what that might mean to you, Lou, is likely going to mean something very different to me. And there are a lot of different variables and characteristics of that. But do we talk about that? Do we talk about that as part of the work that we do? And I think it'd be a missed opportunity to not include us as part of that process, in addition to trying to center all of our participants as well.
Hmm. So, can you talk a little bit more about the idea of the safety plan? Because I can see
Mm.
it in the context of working with people you're doing research with directly. And I know you've done some work through the VA with veterans who are homeless and helping them receive health care. I can certainly see in that population that's like a really important concept, because it's so fraught. The idea of safety is maybe not even possible for many of them, unfortunately. Do you see taking something like the concept of a safety plan to like a more quote conventional design context, like Startup X is creating a new app for such and such? Does the safety plan apply for the users of that app?
I would say yes, and I think there are two different ways that I'm thinking about, and how we could create something or react to that. One could be, um, are we are we operating and doing this work from a foundation of committing to doing no harm? So that's
Mm-hmm.
one way. Another way to, I think, to sort of think about that, a similar concept along that line, is how do we or how will we assess for risk while we are building this thing or doing this, trying to solve or resolve this problem or build something new? So, because it could be a program, it could be a policy, it doesn't always have to be a tangible, like, good or item. I really feel like I can see where it could apply in any single kind of a context. I'm thinking about a question that someone recently asked after a talk that I gave, that said, uh, the scenario was interesting. They said, I work in finance, as a service designer, and I just don't see where like trauma like would come up at all in that context. Like, how could I even potentially apply any of these things to what I'm doing? And so, of course, like my social work brain is saying, like, like there's absolutely trauma in finance. Like, what? Like, maybe we need to bring in some social workers for you to talk with. But I said, well, let's just assume, for the sake of discussion, let's just assume that there isn't in the explicit work that you're doing or the way that you're going to be conducting your design work. What if you take a lens that is more along the lines of, what about my colleague or my peer who is
Hmm.
part of this project, who is part of this work? What if there is something that has nothing to do with our work at hand, that is something that they might be struggling with, that we may or may not know about? That people may show up with these things, and we all carry all kinds of things with us all day long, that sometimes are much bigger and overwhelming, and other times we're able to kind of contain it, if you will. But my response was really along these lines of, if you're working with humans, and most of us are, primarily working with other people, like, you are most certainly working with trauma, whether it is present and obvious, in a day to day. So what would it look like? So again, kind of like digging a little bit deeper, what would it look like if we just assumed that everyone is probably dealing with something? It doesn't necessarily have to be trauma, but what if what if we're all in recovery from
Hmm.
something? I mean, what would it look like for us to show up in a different way and in a different capacity as a designer? And how could I be, present and supportive, and again, bringing in all these different social work values into that work, with that understanding that maybe the work that someone is doing, or the participant that we have as part of this work, maybe they're doing their absolute best, and that's okay. Like, but how do we accept that, and but then also look for these signs and these clues as to what that might look like in the actual work, and how we can respond in a compassionate way that is trauma informed.
You know, it's really interesting for me to hear this because, and this may just be my own personal misunderstanding of what social work really is, but I
Mhm.
think of social work as something associated with treatment, and maybe in the healthcare system in the United States, it often is, where social workers are brought in to help people who need help at a particular moment when they may already have or be experiencing trauma. But part of what I hear you saying, not all, but part of it, in terms of the intersection of social work and design, is almost as a preventive measure to at least contain and maybe identify potential unintended consequences of the design work. And that's interesting. So you mentioned policy before, and policy, as I'm learning from one of our soon-to-be authors, Alex Schmidt, who's writing a book on design and policy. It's just interesting how we as designers can kind of like get find try to claw our ways earlier into the process of at least understanding, if not being involved with how policies developed and how that impacts design and therefore impacts people.
Yes.
And I think it's similar. I think what you're saying, that if we want to truly design in ways that are going to prevent trauma, um, we have to make sure we're involved earlier and
Mm.
with better tools. And social work provides us with some better tools that will help
Yeah.
it become more preventive than, okay, now our designs have created all these horrible problems. Now what?
I mean, I appreciate you saying that, because it really makes me think of systems thinking,
Hmm.
systems redesign. I mean, those were huge concepts within the work that I did at Veterans Affairs. I started there at a time when there was a huge initiative to have a systems redesign coordinator at every single facility around the country. And the opportunity to get to work on some of those projects, and to get the training on Lean Six Sigma. I mean, again, very similar things that are like
Hmm.
right up against a lot of the design concepts and methods that we use. And that appreciation and understanding of systems, and of complexity, of incrementalism, like, how do we really truly shift and change things, both from the inside, but also adjacently on the outside? And then when are there times when some systems that have been built are just need to be gone and we need to build new ones? And so
Mm-hmm.
there's so much opportunity for social workers and designers to be working literally alongside each other, or to be integrating these things with one another to approach these things. And that's one of the other things that I really have appreciated seeing, and that I try to bring in different ways in my own work around trauma informed design, because I really think that it's yes, are there small ways that you can practice this? Absolutely. There are small behavior changes that we can do, literally right now or tomorrow or next week. But I think if you really want to commit to this new way of doing design, it takes bringing in not just other disciplines like social work, because that's what it is for me,
Mm-hmm.
but what are other ways of understanding the world? And for me, a lot of that comes down to understanding systems, and reflecting on where have you been part of systems that are interacting with other systems and potentially causing harm or influencing how another system might be, have a lack of resources and be unable to do the work that it might need to do. I mean, it's where the work can really mushroom very quickly. So it's good to have a focus if you can within that. But it's one of the things that I think is that I appreciate as a macro social worker, because I might not have
Mm-hmm.
necessarily learned that if I had just gone the deep clinical route, even though I have my clinical licensure at this point and have maintained it and will continue to maintain it. I didn't take any clinical classes outside of my foundational training. It was really looking at systems and policy and programs, and how do we evaluate those programs, and how are we going to change these programs? How do you advocate for people? What's the history of advocacy in the United States? I mean, so then when I get thrown into a very deeply clinical environment like VA, I knew I had to find a way to make sense of both of these ways of approaching social work, which then just, I feel like, looking back, it strengthened that tenacity and that interest that I had when it came to design.
Well, you it's going to be really interesting to see in the coming few years. I'm guessing you're a trailblazer. There's going to be more social workers joining the field, and boy, we need them. So thank you for helping open that door. We have to wrap, unfortunately, but before we do, in the tradition of the Rosenfeld Review, I'd love to know what you're reading or whom you're following that you believe deserves a little bit of extra sunlight.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many things. Like you can't see it as you're listening to the podcast, and you can't see it, Lou. But I'm just surrounded by both design and social work books. Um, but I would say if there's one thing, and I've mentioned this almost every single time I talk, but there is this paper that Tad Hirsch, a professor at Northeastern University, wrote 2 years ago at this point, called Practicing Without a License: Design Research as Psychotherapy. And I just feel like that paper really speaks to all these different things that we've been talking about today, things that we'll be talking about, at the actual conference, and then things that I will definitely continue to develop and share with others. So it's free, it's accessible. A lot of academic papers sometimes are behind a paywall. This one is not.
We'll make sure we
And
include a link
yeah,
in the
yeah.
write up.
I that to me is like, it's just it sets the stage for talking about trauma informed design research.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great background, but you could do that, and you could attend Advancing Research 2022 and hear from and talk directly with Rachael Dietkus. She's going to be part of a panel, Learnings from Applying Trauma-Informed Principles to the Research Process, along with Matt Bernius, Aditi Joshi, and Alba Villamil on March 10th. The conference itself runs March 9th through 11th. It is virtual. Take it or leave it. It's the time we live in. I will say, at least, as much as we miss having meetings in person, we feel like our virtual format has been pretty strong, and people seem to enjoy it. And we certainly enjoyed having you both at Civic Design 2021, Rachael, and on the podcast today. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next month at Advancing Research.
Thank you so much, Lou.
Thanks for listening to the Rosenfeld Review, brought to you by Rosenfeld Media. If you like our show, please subscribe and review it on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast platform. I'd love it if you tell a friend to have a listen, and check out our website for over 100 podcasts with other interesting people. You'll find them all at rosenfeldreview.com.